Hey folks, Ardwulf here. As promised, we have a storage solutions video using this game as our example, La Bataille de Quatre. This is from Clash of Arms. There will be an unboxing video along at some point as well. But in the meantime, between then and now, I have managed to get this completely clipped and organized. So let's show you how I did it. Now this is in the 1-inch flat box that Clash of Arms was known to use from time to time. This is approximately the same form factor that GDW's flat boxes were in. And it's a pretty inconvenient box for counter storage for reasons that ought to be relatively obvious. You're going to have a little bit of trouble getting a counter tray in here along with everything else, because the counter tray, standard GMT counter tray, is more than half as wide as this box, and so is the rule books, and so is all the other stuff. So that's a little bit problematic. And truthfully, I think that the general methodology that I want to use for war games is that I want to organize them in such a way that it expedites the game's setup. And I was able to do that here by using baggies. And I'm not sure that I have done a video on baggies in the past. So we're going to talk about that here. So we've got these numbered markers that represent hits. We've got a couple of other miscellaneous unlabeled bags of markers. But all of the units are organized into these bags. Now the trick here, and this is the case with every La Bataille game that I've got, I'm not sure it's the case with all of them, although they may also be available on one of the websites, is that you get these setup cards that kind of help you keep the units and commands organized. And in the case of Quatre, there's actually like more units than you actually need for the Battle of Quatre itself, because you're supposed to be able to combine this and La Bataille de Ligny together to do, and together those give you all the units that you need for Mont Saint Jean, which is Waterloo, which happens a couple of days later. So there's two of these, and what I did was, in order to do this, I laid all these counters out on the setup cards, and then from these, using these as a template, because you're going to, set up Alton's division, I believe, right? So Alton's division has its own baggie here. Now these are the 2 by 3 inch baggies that are found in the craft section at Walmart, and I believe them to be the best economic solution for baggies, especially if you need them in quantity, because as you can see, this is a smallish La Bataille game, and I still used quite a few baggies. If I was going to implement this same solution, which I think is a good solution for another game that I'll talk about in a minute, then I think I would end up using a couple of hundred of these baggies. So basically there's a color coding. I made these fancy little cards, which I printed on cardstock on my printer, and cut them out, and they are sized in such a way so that they will A, fit into the bags, and B, I can get 18 of them on a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, which is the standard paper size here in the US. There's also an amusing typo on one of the cards, so please feel free to play the fun game whereby you spot the typo. The interesting thing is, because I have Mont Saint Jean as well, you may have seen the unboxing video of that, I can use these same cards just by changing the title for that game as well for Mont Saint Jean, because the units are the same. I'll have to do it for Ligny as well, but I've got the individual games. Now, if you have the expansion kit version of Mont Saint Jean, which doesn't give you the counters, you're supposed to use the counters from the other two games on those maps and with those rules. But I didn't want to deal with that. I'd rather have a complete game in the box and a complete game in the other box. So I got the full version. Now I did color code these. I'm not sure how well that's coming out in the display, but the allied units, the coalition units, are have a red type, and the French and French allied units have blue type. I feel like in this light that's not particularly obvious, but that is nevertheless the case. And I did make cards for some of the markers, but not all of them. To be completely truthful, I don't even know what these things are. There's the disorder markers. Some of the bags are a bit overstuffed. That was a consideration when determining exactly how many units to try to fit into a bag, but they have bigger bags at Walmart as well. These are the, I believe, 3 by 4 inch bags, and I can do exactly the same technique with the bigger bags using bigger little cards, and I'll show you that in a minute, except that I can only get 6 of those cards on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, so it's considerably more paper intensive, which is in itself is not a big deal. It's not necessarily more toner intensive. I originally had this done with just handwritten and hand cut little cards, but these are way nicer. I actually printed them out, cut them with the paper cutter, so everything's nice and even and all that stuff. And I have what I think will be a very expeditious solution for actually setting up La Bataille de Quatre for play. So I have applied this same technique thus far to one other game, and I'm thinking of it for a third game. Let's talk about that next. So game number 2, this is actually the first game that I organized in this exact way. And it's a little bit different. I'm going to talk about the circumstances that led me to do it a little bit differently for Fatal Alliances here than I did for Quatre. So because you're kind of organizing your units in commands and formation in La Bataille, that's how they're organized on those setup cards. That is how they are organized in that game. However, for Fatal Alliances, and as you can see, I used a lot of baggies here, in a couple of different sizes. I used the little 2x3 baggies, but I also, because a lot of these countries have kind of a lot of units that are in play in 1914, so we have a large baggie that includes all the units up to 1914. So the way Fatal Alliances works is just like if you're familiar with World in Flames, from this point of view, it's identical. You have a number of force pools per major power, and then each year you add new units to those force pools. So these are all the Commonwealth units up to 1914. So at the beginning of the game, if you're playing it from the beginning, you are going to take the Commonwealth. If you're playing the Commonwealth, you're going to take this bag and you're going to sort these into the various Commonwealth force pools. When you call out your reserves, you'll sort these units into your force pool. And then when it hits the year on the baggie, you'll sort these units into your force pool. So these are the 1918 units. Same deal with Italy. I think I got all the Italian units up to 1914 in one baggie as well. And then most of these are actually the, I think, 1.5x2 baggies, also from Walmart. And I actually bought these by mistake, thinking they were the 2x3s. And then I got the bag home and I'm like, oh, geez, I didn't know I was buying these. What am I going to do with these? And it turns out that they work basically exactly the same way. In this case, I've combined all 3 of the Baltic states counters. I mean, there's only 4 counters into one little baggie. Romania, which is kind of a major minor, gets its own little baggie. I think almost all of the minor miners, get a little baggie like this. And then Venezuela and Colombia go together. That's 2 counters. Arabia and Ethiopia, that's 2 counters. They go together. And they're sort of geographically proximate, so that's how I set that up. Iraq, which gets, again, 2 counters. Afghanistan, 2 counters. So most of the miners are in these. Now I used a lot of baggies, as you can see. Almost the whole box is filled with these things. Now this, of course, leads me to ask the question of whether I should adapt this methodology to World in Flames. And initially that idea is very attractive. However, my personal set of World in Flames, and I don't have everything for it, but I have what is essentially World in Flames Collector's Edition Deluxe, so the core game, and then the 4 main expansions, plus Days of Decision, which kind of needs to be done on its own, and which I used a completely different and much simpler methodology for organizing the counters, but I also did it in baggies because that seemed to be the right way to do it at the time. Now, the current methodology for World in Flames is actually to sort all the counters, and you may have seen that Storage Solutions video, or 2 videos actually, because I was like one when it was in progress and once when it was finished. You may recall that I use 5 of these. These are Doris bead trays. You cannot find them anymore because Doris got bought by Michaels and basically shut down. You can still get identical trays from Michaels, only now they're about $15, and I can't seem to find them on Amazon. I got these from Amazon for about $6 a piece, but you can order a 6-pack directly from Michaels, and they're about $6.50 a piece. So that's one way to get to this. And I made a label for the top, which tells me what's where, and then a label for the side, which I'd like to redo all these because these are just printed on paper and then taped on. If I was redoing these, I would do it on self-adhesive paper and stick it on, and that just works better and looks better and all that. So this is a similar methodology, though, except instead of baggies, I'm using compartments. So here's all the UK units from 1936 or earlier. Note that you can start your World in Flames game in 1936 if you are using Days of Decision. If you're just using World in Flames, it'll start in 1939. But if you're starting in 1939, then you just take 36, 37, 38, and 39 and assemble your force pools from there. And then each subsequent year, you add the new units. I have sorted out some of the optional markers, like the classic ships. The main compartments include the Ships in Flames ships, which replace the classic ships. You use one set or the other. We have conditionals and reserves, so if the UK meets a specific condition, we might get conditional units that arise, and those show up in the force pools. When they call up their reserves, those might show up in the force pools as well. Each country has a relatively small set of markers for things like task forces and stuff like that. So if I were going to adapt the Baggie solution to World in Flames, I don't think I'd want to do it exactly like I've done it here. I think I would want to sort it out in a couple of different ways. I would first of all want all optional units, including the Ships in Flames ships, which are currently mixed in separate baggies, so that I could choose when I was setting the game up whether I'm using Ships in Flames or whether I'm just using the classic ships. I kind of feel like if you've got Ships in Flames, you should just use it because it's pretty much just more ships. There are some additional optional rules which you're not necessarily obligated to use. But I would further probably choose, and I'd probably end up using the small, might end up using the 1.5 by 2 bags actually. I might actually end up sorting them not only by year, but also by individual force pool, and then each additional optional rule that includes or incorporates additional units would get its own baggie, so that I could say, I'm using the oil rules. Here are the markers for oil. There are a couple of markers associated with oil. I am using Red Banner armies. Here's the baggie with Red Banner armies. So you could pick and choose based on this particular set of with optional rules that you were using. The downside to that is, man, that's going to be a lot of baggies, because you can see I've got 16 compartments for each major power as it is, and British ships, it's mostly ships, have really lifted this 1936 or earlier, because they got a lot of old ships on afloat in 1936. There's a lot of ships here. There are actually more units in 1936 or earlier than the Americans have. And it's mostly ships. So you'd have to separate those into force pools, right? But you have a separate force pool for cruisers, which are optional, versus carriers, versus battleships, versus escort carriers. So there's a lot of different force pools, and I think for each year I'd need something like 20 to 40 baggies, depending on exactly what was available for that particular country. Like I did with Fatal Alliances, I would just almost universally, except for the really important minors like Romania, I would probably just put all the say Bulgarian counters in a single bag and then sort it out when you activate Bulgaria, because we're not talking about 2 million counters. But in the case of, the Commonwealth, you got a lot of counters, and even in the case of France, there's quite a few, right? I mean, you've got all this stuff, and there's some markers. They're not really markers, because their pilots are like units, right, that you're going to build. So I figured I might as well just put them in with the 1936 units, because if you're using the pilot rule, which is another optional rule where you actually have to train the pilots alongside building the planes, the cost ends up being the same, if that's a concern, by the way. But they're separate. So if you lose a plane unit, then the pilot might survive and you might get the pilot back. Thus obviating the need to train new pilots to replace the guys that got killed. It's a neat rule. I am a bit wishy-washy on it, but I would probably be inclined to use it because I don't think it adds particular amount of overhead. or a particular or much overhead. That is, it's just kind of an additional thing that you can build, except that you need them. Unlike say divisions, where yeah, it's just adding more units, and you can choose to build them or not, but you're kind of disadvantaging yourself if you don't build the divisions. If you're using the divisions rules, those are additional optional units. So that's been a kind of a breeze through of 3 different games that I've used to organize with this particular baggy technique, depending on the particular demands of the counter mix for that game. Like I said, the 2 that I've actually done are La Bataille de Quatre, and I'm totally going to use this same methodology for additional La Bataille games. I think it makes way more sense than anything else I could come up with. I absolutely can't get a sufficient number of counter trays in these boxes. Just looking at the box, yeah, I don't think I can get a single counter tray in without a box bulge. Quatre, I believe, is still available from Clash of Arms, by the way, and I know Fatal Alliance is in relatively low stock, but they do have them at Compass. I picked that up at Compass Expo if you saw the loot video. Pretty excited about this, actually. It's a very interesting looking game, and the learning curve between it and Whiff is pretty small, as far as I could tell. So hopefully you found this valuable. If so, please do give it a thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel for more Wargaming content. If you have any ideas or opinions on how to store either of these games, or World in Flames for that matter, which we've already seen a couple of videos on that from me and from Steve Dolges, please pipe up in the comments. I'd like to give a special shout out to the patrons of Ardwulf's Lair, without whose assistance and support would be much more difficult to do any of the kinds of content that we do here. So thank you, patrons. Thank you for watching the video. Until next time, happy wargaming.